Okay, for real now. Good evening. Thanks so much for coming out. My name is Andy Graybill, and I'm the director of the Clement Center for Southwest Studies here at SMU. Let me start by thanking the many people, well, there are at least a few of them, who have helped make this evening possible, starting with our friends at the Center for Presidential History, with whom we are co-sponsoring this event tonight, particularly Jeffrey Engel, Brian Franklin, and Ronna Spitz. I also want to thank Ruth Ann Elmore, who coordinates things on our end for the Clement Center. So it's my pleasure to introduce Cameron Blevins, who braved last night's weather to fly in from Denver, where he teaches U.S. History and Digital Humanities at the University of Colorado's campus in the Mile High City. Before moving to the Front Range, he was assistant professor of history at Northeastern University in Boston and a core faculty member at the school's NU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks. As I learned last night, Cameron is a native of the Nutmeg State. For those of you who are anybody know what the Nutmeg State is? A number of you. I was really hoping that I was going to be able to enlighten you. Although he bolted for the palm trees and the sunny skies of Southern California when he studied at Pomona College as an undergraduate. He liked the West so much that he moved up Interstate 5 to Stanford, where he completed his PhD in history in 2015. He already boasts an impressive publication record, and tonight he's here to discuss with us his most significant accomplishment to date, which is Paper Trails, the U.S. Post and the Making of the American West, published earlier this year by Oxford University Press. Following his lecture, Cameron will be happy to take your questions and afterwards to sign books, which are available for purchase just outside. I think the drill is to buy them outside and then to bring them back here so that Cameron can sign them. So please join me in welcoming Cameron Blevins.
All right, I think I'm all set here. Can everyone hear me all right? Good? Okay. Just want to make sure. Thank you so much for coming here tonight. And also I want to start by just thanking Andy, obviously, in the Clement Center for inviting me, along with Brian Franklin in the Center for Presidential History. Ruth Ann Elmore also has been fabulous organizing this, so I want to thank that. And thank all of you for coming. Before I get started, can I get a show of hands here? How many folks have sent or received a handwritten letter in the last 2 weeks? Okay. How many folks have been to their post office in the last 2 weeks? Okay. How many folks collect stamps? Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Okay. I like just getting a sense for where everyone's coming from, what their interests are here. So I just wanted to see what that was like first. Okay. So we're actually going to start in a slightly different place, and that is the Salt River Valley in central Arizona. It's about 100 miles east of present-day Phoenix, and we're going back in time to September of 1886. Now, obviously, it's Arizona in September, so it's extremely hot. It's about 100 degrees out. September 8th, 1886. And we're going to zoom down to the house of Benjamin and Mary Curtis, living in the middle of the Salt River Valley on a ranch. And Benjamin Curtis is sitting there. Mary is napping. And Benjamin sits down to write a letter. Now, Benjamin's life at this point had involved this kind of nomadic existence, actually born in Ohio, the youngest of four siblings. He and his his three siblings were orphans at a very young age and kind of scattered to live with relatives across the country. Briefly served in the Civil War, underage at the time, was in the Navy. After the war, started moving west, crossed the railroad, eventually settled in Northern California, worked as a store clerk, spent some time trying to open up his own store, made an orange grove in Southern California, and then eventually relocated again to the middle of Arizona to start a ranch. This is in the 1880s. This is where he met Mary, his 21-year-old neighbor, actually, and they got married after a very short courtship, and a year later, she gave birth. And this is when he sat down to write a letter. Now, his letter is written to his two older sisters who lived in San Diego, California at the time. And he was basically sharing the news, saying, "Your little niece is sleeping nicely and the mother is doing well also. Last Sunday a.m. at 1:30 o'clock, we were made happy by its successful arrival." He went on to report, "It is a trying time for any mother, but Mary stood it bravely, and although it is 100 degrees here, now in this room, she does not complain, but is just as sweet as ever." And then my personal favorite part, "We think it is just the nicest baby ever born, only it doesn't take after its father because it has plenty of hair on the top of its head." As you can see, Benjamin had a pretty severe receding hairline. And then finally, he closed the letter with what I think is the most touching part. Oh. Okay. Try that again. There we go. Now for its name. Mary says she thinks Delia Henrietta would do nicely, and so do I. And this letter was addressed to his older sisters, Delia and Henrietta Curtis, telling them that they are naming their baby after her aunts. This is especially poignant, right? These, again, are orphans. They had lost their own parents. They're the last remaining generation, and this is the first member of the next generation. And this connection across Arizona over to Southern California, connecting these family members together. These particular pieces of paper here, they're part of a collection of dozens and dozens of letters between the Curtis siblings. And they're housed at the Huntington Library in Southern California in Pasadena. I've read every single one of these letters. And basically they span from the 1840s when they were orphaned all the way to the 1890s. It's a remarkable collection. These letters are in many ways the paper trails of the past. And as historians, we come across these paper trails all the time, everywhere, often in archives like the Huntington Library. And we're trained to read, analyze these pieces of paper, right? Squeeze each and every one for every last bit of information, every piece of insight into the past. And we're rewarded with a richness of detail, right? Letters like this one, offering these intimate glimpses into past lives, the experiences of long dead people, right? A new parent sitting down in the 100-degree heat to write a letter, cracking jokes about his hairline, but also sharing this deeply meaningful moment with people he loved. But we historians are not necessarily as good at recognizing how these paper trails were generated. In the case of letters in particular, that bread and butter of the historical archive, understanding the simple fact that these pieces of paper had to travel from point A to point B, that without this journey, without this paper physically traveling from Benjamin's table in the Salt River Valley to his sister's letterbox in San Diego post office about 400 miles away, this scrap of paper is just a scrap of paper. That is what gives it meaning. And I noticed in reading all of these pieces of paper written by the Curtis siblings, they kept mentioning other stuff that's passing between them, traveling through the mail. Mary and Benjamin, living on their ranch, subscribed to half a dozen newspapers and magazines from across the country, in places like San Francisco, Chicago, New York, a nearby city in Globe. Benjamin subscribed to the American Agriculturalist, a farming magazine. Mary subscribed to the Delineator, a women's magazine. All of this stuff. In those letters, they mentioned other things, asking them to send fiction, but good. Send by mail. Benjamin asked for mother and father's photo. Mentioned them sending a silk kerchief, flannel, pins, napkin rings, $21, a suitable breast pen, laces, ribbons, bibs, muslin, a bundle of San Diego papers. All of this material traveling across that distance. And that provided all of these connections to Benjamin and Mary. And the importance of these grows even more remarkable when you stop for a second to zoom out and think about where they are living at the time. I cannot drive home for you how remote the Salt River Valley is. This is the rugged western backcountry that you see in Hollywood films, right? When he moved there 2 years ago, he was a bachelor, and he wrote in a letter that he complained all he had for company were his cows and his horses. The nearest doctor was a 30-mile horse ride away in the city of Globe. He was utterly alone, except that he wasn't. The mail connected him to the family that he had left behind in the wider world. Right? He was able to use the mail to stay connected. He wrote this letter on September 8th. 3 days later, September 11th, he walked out his front door and walked about 15 minutes to the nearest post office, Catalpa, less than a mile away. Dropped it off again on September 11th. 4 days later, on September 15th, it showed up in the San Diego post office. 4 days to go from the middle of nowhere, Arizona, to San Diego, right? Traveling, again, 400 miles across mesa and scrubland and desert and mountains, and ends up in the hands of his sister. All of this means that had to travel across a network of post offices and mail routes that connected these two places. And it traveled across a network that was arguably the most expansive communication network on the planet at the time, the US Post. So, what I'd like to argue here today, and this is the core subject of my book, is that you cannot understand the United States in the late 19th century, and in particular, you cannot understand this process of Western expansion that defined this era as millions of Americans poured westward into all these remote places, like the Salt River Valley, without understanding the role of the US Post in this process. So, a little context for you. 3 years later, the Postmaster General of the United States, John Wanamaker, who's basically the head of the entire US postal system, reported that, in his annual report to Congress, the visible form of the federal government to every community, every citizen, he's talking about the US Post, it's the only one that touches the local life, the social interests, and business concern of every neighborhood. And went on to share that there are 58,999 post offices and 669,766 kilometers of mail routes operating in the United States. But what do those numbers mean, right? We can dismiss this as kind of hyperbole of a bureaucrat trying to advertise what his department is doing. And I'm willing to bet if I said 28,000 or if I said 88,000, it probably wouldn't have made that much of a difference to you. We're not that good at understanding some of these numbers when they're operating at this scale. And so in part, what my research has done is try to understand what some of these numbers mean. And to do that, I've turned to a method broadly known as digital history. This is a kind of loosey-goosey umbrella term about using computers and technology to study, teach, or communicate about the past in some way. Now, I think at this point, if the last year and a half has taught us anything, in many ways, I think we're all digital historians, right? We are all interacting with the past, learning about the past, in large part through screens. But in my case of this project, I was specifically using data, using quantitative data to try to conduct research, look for patterns, and then visualize those patterns about the past in this topic. So you can start to understand what the size of the US Post actually was in 1889. This is showing on the x-axis here the length of mail routes in kilometers, and on the y-axis the number of post offices operated by different countries across the world. The United States is a complete outlier. It has several times the number of post offices, several times the length of mail routes operating in 1889. But I was also able to use a different data set. The reason why I asked if anyone was a stamp collector is that much of this book basically is due to this man right here, Richard Helbach. He was a prolific stamp collector and also a postal historian. And he actually passed away in 2011 before I had a chance to actually discover a lot of his work, but he spent decades of his life collecting information about nearly every post office that operated in the United States throughout its history. And he created a data set of about 166,000 post offices. And I stumbled upon his work when I was a graduate student, sent $80 to his widow at the time, who mailed me a CD. And then I was able to basically receive all of the data for my entire research agenda. So thank you, Richard. Best $80 I've ever spent, and I obviously owe him quite a bit. So what he did was he went back into the archives, looked at microfilmed reels. The US Postal System captured a lot of information at the time. They recorded basically information about every post office, and he transcribed this into a spreadsheet of data, right? Having the name of the post office, the state and county where it operated, and the years when it was opened and then closed. Incredibly rich data set. Now his goal was to provide a kind of standardized list of post offices for stamp collectors to try to evaluate how rare a particular letter or cover, as they're known, was if it originated at a particular post office. I am less interested in stamp collecting, I have to admit, but this is an incredible historical data set. And so what I did was I took this data and then, I'm not going to go into the details, but basically had to use kind of computer programming to try to figure out where those 166,000 post offices were located. And again, I'm not going to go into all the, I was tempted to just walk through 300 lines of computer code, but I'll spare you that torture. The end result, though, this is what 166,000 post offices looks like on a map. Again, roughly speaking, not complete, but most post offices that operate in the United States over its entire history. And what we can do also, now that we have these post offices, is start to drill down into specific years to see what it looked like at different points in time. So this is what 58,999 post offices operating in 1889 looks like. So when Postmaster General John Wanamaker said, basically it's the only entity that touches the business concern and social life of every neighborhood, every community, he wasn't really exaggerating. With some exceptions, there was a post office in nearly every community in the United States. And so you can start to understand how this individual post office that was serving, in this case, Benjamin Curtis, connected him into this national system of information spread across the country, gave him access to all of these different places. So, again, continent-spanning information network. It was huge. It was expansive. But we could also use this data to look and study how this network got to this point. Because if Benjamin had moved to the Salt River Valley even 10 years before, he would not have been able to send letters to his sisters. That connectivity that depended on the US Post's ability to expand into distant places in lockstep with American settlers like Benjamin Curtis. And you're about to see that with really fine-grained detail. This is the expansion of the US postal system, starting on the East Coast, obviously, a kind of narrow band, and then again, moving in conjunction with Americans. And in the 1840s, you start to see this kind of explosion of post offices in the far west, lining up with the seizure of territory, violent seizure of territory from Mexico during the Mexican-American War, and then the eventual occupation of that land by settlers. So, this system is able to move incredibly quickly across this vast territory and again into these distant corners of the West. But also what I started to notice, which was even more remarkable to me, was that it wasn't just expanding, it was also contracting from those same areas almost simultaneously. This is showing a map of post offices in gray, and then on top of them, in red, post offices that either changed names or locations or discontinued entirely in 1884. And if you go through each year, you're seeing hundreds and hundreds of post offices shutting down across the western United States, and really the entire country. And in fact, if you compare just in a 25-year, quarter-century period leading up to 1889, post offices that were newly opened versus post offices that were shut down, it almost looks like a kind of ghostly skeleton of the other one, right? So this process of expansion is also extremely unstable, where it's opening up in all these thousands of places, but also withdrawing from many of those places almost simultaneously. So over 25 years, 48,000 US post offices had either closed, changed names, or moved locations across that time period. Roughly 1,900 post offices every year. If you look at some of these offices, it is remarkable how quickly they shut down. This is an example from Arizona. Esperanza, opened on February 26th, October 9th, shut down. What is going on? Well, if you also look at the people who are running these post offices, it's just as unstable. In the late 19th century, during this period, about 1 out of every 6 postmasters across the country was either removed, resigned, or died in office every single year. 1 out of 6. But this followed particular patterns. In this case, I'm just showing postmasters who were removed from office by the administration. And what you're seeing is that the post office department is operated by the executive branch, the presidency. So whenever the presidency changes political parties, from Republicans to Democrats, you see a giant spike in the number of postmasters who are removed from office. This is a political machine. Basically, they're saying, okay, Democrats come in, we're going to remove a bunch of Republican postmasters and install local Democratic operators, right? And vice versa. So this workforce is also incredibly unstable as well. All of this adds up to what I've termed a Gossamer Network. This idea of a kind of ethereal, gauzy web. It's able to quickly expand into different places, but then also contract, pull back, withdraw. This is not what, at least, I tend to think of when I think of government institutions, right? Fast-moving, nimble, but also incredibly ephemeral and unstable. So who cares, right? Why do we care that the US Post operated in this way? Why does this matter? What I argue is that these features actually have a series of implications for understanding several larger processes that define the 19th century United States. One of the most important of these. This is a larger process of settler colonial occupation that unfolded across the 1800s. So settler colonialism, this is the removal of an indigenous population from a territory and its replacement by a settler society. In this case, the removal of native people from the American West and the occupation by American settlers. The US Post did not cause settler colonial expansion, but it did facilitate it in incredibly important and really underappreciated ways. So, in some ways, I think the maps that I've shown so far are quite misleading. They are intentionally lying to you. Post offices did not fill in an empty continent. The American West was very much not empty at the time. What we can do with digital history is layer on other kinds of data to see these types of patterns. This is showing the US postal system in 1865 overlaid onto, in dark gray, government reservations, Indian reservations. And then in light gray, land that had not been officially ceded by Native people to the United States government. And what you're seeing is that in a lot of areas of the West, especially the Western interior, groups of Native people were blocking the expansion of both settlers and the US government. The Lakota in the Northern Plains, the Comanche in West Texas, the Apache in Arizona, where Benjamin would eventually end up. But these two processes, settler colonial expansion, native dispossession, and then postal expansion, went hand in hand. And you can see the expansion of the postal system into areas that had only recently been seized, often through violence, from Native people in the West. To zoom in to a particular place to show you what I mean by this process. This is my state of Colorado, where I currently live, and this is in 1870. In 1870, most of the kind of western third of Colorado was occupied by groups of Ute people. and white settlers were forbidden from trespassing onto Ute land. That did not last very long. Prospectors streamed into the southwestern corner of the state, into the San Juan Mountains, in search of gold. And in 1873, government officials renegotiated with several Ute leaders and reached the so-called Bruno Agreement. And this ceded southwestern chunk of land, about 3.7 million acres, to the United States. And this is what happened next. Again, the U.S. Post is not causing this, but it is oftentimes on the front lines of this occupation of plundered native territory. And I can show you similar patterns across the western United States from this period. Basically, the U.S. Post is able to expand into these distant places in lockstep with settlers. So again, if we return to Benjamin Curtis, living in Arizona in the late 1880s, he's actually living about 16 miles west of the White Mountain Indian Reservation, the U.S. government reservation for groups of Apaches that have been forced to live inside those borders. It was administered by the Office of Indian Affairs, and there was a garrison of U.S. Army troops stationed there. Benjamin was living on recently plundered land and was able to live there fully connected to the wider world, again, despite it being incredibly remote, distant, and removed. And so mapping the U.S. Post, understanding how it operated as a spatial network, in particular some of those Gossamer features, I think it forces us to reconsider the role of the American state in this process of American colonialism. This wasn't just, again, white people moving onto empty land. And it wasn't just white settlers occupying native land. Right? This was a process that was facilitated by the American state, by the U.S. government. So the second thing that this kind of research did for me was that it forced me to rethink a lot of what I thought I knew about the American state, how it operated, and its history. Something I kept coming back to when I would look at these maps, look at this data, all these patterns, right? Fast-moving, expansive, deeply unstable. I kept asking myself, how did this thing even work, right? How do post offices open, shut down a couple months later, and yet still, Benjamin and Mary Curtis are able to sit in their living room in the middle of nowhere, reading letters and newspapers and magazines from across the country. How did this system work? I want to apologize for a second because I'm going to get down to the scholarly weeds here, but I can't talk about the American state without mentioning this man, Max Weber, German sociologist, and in many ways, I think, has defined what a lot of people and scholars for a long time thought of as the state. He defined it in largely two ways. First of these, a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. This is coercion, right? A state being able to exercise coercion to force people, citizens, those living inside its borders to do things. Second, bureaucracy. Now, he's German, so loves bureaucracy. And he advanced a kind of ideal type or model of bureaucracy. This is what we would associate with many government organizations today, right? Specialized, focused on particular theme or purpose, hierarchically organized, uses written documents, forms, that kind of thing. There's a certain degree of expertise with people that work there. Full-time staff, and there are a set of rules that govern how bureaucracy operates. These two models of the state, right, coercion on the one hand, bureaucracy on the other, I think really shape how, at least I, have thought about state power, the ability of the state to exercise power in some way, either through the force or threat of force, or through its administrative capacity. Which brings us back to the U.S. Post. How did this thing even work? Because if you look at it, it is not operating at all like Max Weber wanted it to, right? This is not a traditional framework of state power. And when you start to drill down and understand how this network functioned, what you see is a completely different model. This is what I've termed the agency model. This is one that is decentralized. Decentralized. People are operating at the periphery with very little centralized oversight. It's also one that relies on private actors rather than government employees. Oftentimes, those actors are temporary, part-time, and they're not paid a full salary. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm guessing a lot of us, at least, are familiar with this image of the U.S. Post today, right? Your local mail carrier wearing their kind of snappy little uniforms, driving around in the trucks. Side note, I learned recently these trucks have been meant to be retired for years now. Mail carriers universally hate them. They do not have air conditioning or heat, and they're kind of falling apart. So just think about that every time you see one of these. Of course, in the 19th century, this is not at all what the U.S. Post looked like. This is not how you got your mail. Instead, the Post Office Department would contract with private stagecoach companies to carry mail along these western routes. So a company would carry passengers, freights, and then they would also have a 4-year temporary contract with the U.S. Post to throw a couple bags of mail into the back and drop them off at various points along their route. Well, post offices, right? This is my local post office in Denver. How many people say this looks fairly familiar to post offices you are either with? Yeah, okay. Ish? All right. Brick building, right? Official sign on the door. You walk inside. Again, there are full-time employees that work behind there. You probably know their names if you go there a lot. This is a bureaucracy, right? This is not how things worked in the 19th century. Instead, what would happen? Again, the Post Office Department would pay a local business person, oftentimes a store owner, to hand out letters across the counter of their store. So you're seeing on the left here, California Post Office from Spadra, and you see under it, Caldwell and Brothers General Store. Or on the right side of the screen, this is in Guerneville, California, post office operating inside a Wells Fargo and Company express station and a jewelry store, right? So this is a public service being grafted onto a private infrastructure. Again, decentralized, private actors, temporary part-time, and non-salaried. And when I stopped to look at this, about 95% of post offices during the 19th century looked like that. They did not look like these big urban post offices that we might recognize today. These postmasters in these offices were paid anywhere from $12 to a couple $100 a year. Again, part-time work. Many of them, as I already mentioned, were either removed from office, left office, moved to the town next door, all the time. So this is constantly shifting. What this did, this agency model, was it allowed it to expand into distant places, but also operate by far the largest and most expansive arm of the federal government. So if you stop to actually map all the locations of the federal government, on the left side, you're seeing about 5,500 post offices operating in the West. And what I did was I went through a government directory and tallied up basically everything else. So this is the rest of the executive branch, U.S. Army, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, all combined, right? Department of the Interior, the Treasury Department, all these other executive agencies. 486 locations. U.S. Post is operating a vastly more expansive system than the rest of the federal government. And I'm happy to talk more, but what ends up happening is that these other entities then start to rely on the U.S. Post to fulfill basic functions because of this spatial coverage. And this spatial coverage is really what sets apart the Post and really gives it so much of its influence. So, again, if we think back to this process of settler colonial occupation, this agency model is what allowed the U.S. Post to move so quickly into the San Juan Mountains, one of the most remote, distant places in the contiguous United States at the time. The reason is, they're not building new brick buildings, right? They're not hiring a full-time staff. They are not buying their own stagecoaches. They are, again, paying commissions, fees, contracts for a store owner, a mine operator, to operate a post office or a stagecoach company that's carrying gold out to the hills, around the hills, to carry mail there. Right? This is the model that allowed the U.S. Post to move so quickly. And it's also not the only entity that is operating along this model. what I started to recognize was that this was actually everywhere. The US pension system. After the Civil War, obviously hundreds of thousands of veterans, Union veterans, disabled, suffered some kind of injury during the war, or left behind if they died during the war, widows, children. And the US government adopts a pension system, starts to pay out money. By the 1890s, this is one of the largest items in the entire federal budget. I believe it's something like 40% of the entire federal budget is going towards this pension system. But if you think about it, right? You have hundreds of thousands of different people who are filing claims to receive money from the government. They have to be evaluated. And the US Pension Office is not going to send a person from Washington, D.C. to every one of these communities across the country. Instead, what they do is they take doctors, surgeons, local doctors, and pay them a commission. Pay them a commission to evaluate the claims of someone to see, okay, do they actually have a bullet in their right leg? How disabled are they? And then how much money are they owed from the federal government? These are private actors, right? Private actors that the US government is paying to perform a service, one that is geographically expansive. Or just last year, right, we had a census. Every 10 years, the US government has to go around and figure out how many people live in this country and where do they live. To do that, they again turn to private actors. These are not full-time employees, and in fact, they are not full-time employees today. These are temporary people working. So for a long time, they would pay, the Marshal Service was actually in charge of the US Census, and they would send out enumerators who were local business people, oftentimes, in fact, postmasters, right? Grafting this onto an existing network to try to perform a service that is geographically expansive. This model defined a lot of aspects of the American state at the time that I found fairly surprising. So this agency model had a whole lot of implications for understanding some of these processes. And I'm going to touch on just kind of 3 very short examples that I explore a lot more in the book, and use that as a little incentive for you to buy the book. These chapters are great. But if we take the first of these, right, a decentralized system, what you see is the U.S. the Post Office Department in Washington, D.C., absolutely struggling to figure out what the hell is going on across the country, right? You have 60,000 post offices operating. They're discontinuing all the time. They're changing names, right? Routes are getting added. Some are getting contracted. And so the person in charge of making maps of this system is just at a complete loss, right? Employs several dozen people to try to produce maps of this network, but it's basically trying to produce a map of a network that refuses to stand still. It's constantly changing. And so what you see instead are the struggles of this office, the topographer's office, to create cartographic representations, maps of this system. So again, highly decentralized network. Private actors, right? What are some implications that come with relying on private actors to provide public services? This might not come as a surprise to people, but in the case of contracting system with stagecoach companies, this bred a tremendous amount of corruption. And in fact, in one of the chapters, I look at a period in the 1870s through the early 1880s, where large stagecoach companies in the West managed to basically cheat the government, where they would manipulate the bidding system for contracts to win these giant inflated contracts worth hundreds of thousands and up to millions of dollars. This is a direct result, again, of relying on private actors to perform a public service while also having a decentralized network where there's basically no administrative check in terms of what is happening on those distant mail routes. And then finally, thinking about temporary, part-time, and then non-salaried positions, in particular the position of a postmaster, is really important for understanding the 19th century United States. You know, looking at this, I kept thinking to myself, why would you want to be a postmaster? You're getting paid $50 a year. Sounds like kind of a lot of administrative work. You know, what's in it for you? And what you see is that it's less about the amount of money they're receiving. And instead, it's about having control over the local post office. Because if you control the local post office, everyone needs to come to your store. This is in a period for the rural United States before residential delivery. So if you wanted to get or send mail, you had to walk to your local post office. And if you were the one that owned that post office, had it housed inside your store, that meant customers had to come in several days a week to get their mail. Maybe they'd buy some cigars or nails, right, at the same time. And that also meant that they were not going to your local competitor down the street. And this led to some fascinating things. If you read the correspondence of any politicians during the 19th century, congressmen, senators, you'll be blown away at how much time they spend talking about post offices and postmasters. Their constituents are constantly writing to them, complaining, saying, Joe Schmo should not have the local post office, I should have the local post office, right? And you have them just expending dozens of letters trying to figure out who's going to be the postmaster, where the post office is going to be located. Because of this, because the way in which a post office operated is the central gathering point of a community. It was around which everything else orbited. And it wasn't just in terms of people coming into your store. It also meant you knew exactly what kind of newspapers they were subscribing to, who they were writing to, right? Postmasters were oftentimes the hub of information, gossip, news about a local community. So there's a tremendous amount of local power exercised by these postmasters. And the location of the post office would actually shape this local space of Western communities. So ultimately, this book, though, is about two different spatial scales. One of these is kind of a large-scale examination. Things like massive national networks, the US postal system, studying its geography, its expansion, how it operated. Trying to bring into view these kind of systems that oftentimes float under the surface, ones that you might see every day but not fully appreciate or understand. And as part of that, I also created, or co-created, I should say, a much more talented web developer helped build this, a companion website to this book. And what this website does is it allows you to scroll through chronologically and start to explore different patterns over time. With some text on the right side explaining some of these big, large-scale geographic patterns about the expansion of the US Post and what was causing it. Again, trying to explain some of these different eras in Western history at a very large scale. I intentionally did not try to do this in the book, right? I did not fill my book with all these maps trying to explain these continental scale patterns. Instead, what I tried to do was balance some of these large-scale patterns with what those patterns meant for individual people. So if we go back to the Curtis family, how a brother in the middle of the Arizona backcountry can use this larger network to share news with his family about the birth of their niece. It's these kind of mundane connections that unfolded across the country thousands and thousands of times every day. Those quiet connections that ultimately knit the 19th century US together. Thank you.
So we'll pause for just a moment, and then in about 10 or 15 seconds, I will let Cameron call his own questions. I'm sure you've got some, and please don't forget that there are books outside available for purchase.
Are we ready? Okay. So, did I hear you earlier say then?
All right, can you raise your hand? I have no idea what. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
My bad. So, did I hear you earlier say then that when you noticed a trend of these presidential candidates of competing parties taking over, coming in and sacking postmasters over and over and over again? Could you expand on that a little bit? Is there some sort of political capacity that these postmasters had in this time that I'm not thinking of? Because I'm certainly understanding how it's a locus of like local community and things like that. I can't understand how they would be able to politically be influential if they can't open the mail, you know?
Yep. So two things I would say. One of which is that if you know the business and connections and news of everyone around you, you're actually in a pretty well-situated position to be a political operative. Second, it is probably less, I would say, about them acting as like a local Democratic operative and more the fact that the Democratic Party in charge is able to dole out these positions as patronage, just kind of rewards for being a Democratic operative, right? So if you're able to get the post office in your store, that is a kind of reward for what you might have done in the previous election. Does that make sense?
I noticed that the letter that Curtis sent to his sister has no address, just San Diego. So was that really that rule back then?
Just go back here. So just to clarify, you are talking about that top letter that basically just says, Miss D.A. Curtis, San Diego, California. That's it. Nothing else, right? This is what's remarkable to me, is that in large cities, you could either have a letterbox in the post office. Some cities at the time did have residential delivery, but everywhere else in the country, you basically just wrote someone's name, the name of the post office, and that's it. And the reason, again, for this is because there's not this kind of address system for every single person in the country, you would have to go to your local post office to pick up your mail. And that also meant, to go back to the idea of the local postmaster, postmaster had to know who everyone was, right? And so there's this tremendous idea that, like, you kind of just went there, and it was this personal local connections that ultimately allowed the network as a whole to operate. And again, this is a very different idea that we have from this kind of bureaucratic system where they're trying to order and say addresses, right? Zip codes are a more modern thing. This was much more reliant on local knowledge. So I think in many ways it kind of embodies the larger system as a whole, where it's decentralized and highly dependent on these local actors. Yep.
I'm gonna get these two right here. I'll start here and then. That was great, and you focused on the sociological implications of the post office. There was also something happening in the 1800s that's commerce, and the beginnings of the mail order catalogs at that point, after the Civil War, and the movement of merchandise and more particularly money back and forth. How did the post office handle the commerce, and how did the post office eventually get kicked out of the commerce?
You were going to love chapter 6. It's entirely about the money order system. So the money order system, to give some background, started during the Civil War, and the basic idea was that soldiers, Union soldiers serving on the front lines, needed a way to send home their wages to family members on the home front without sending physical money through the mail that might get lost or stolen, right? And so the idea behind it was that you would go to your local post office and that you would say, here's $10. You're going to fill out a form. The postmaster would then stamp the form, mail the form itself to wherever you want to send it to, and then whoever you were sending it to would show up, and then they would get $10 from that postmaster, right? So it became a kind of almost like a small-scale checking system. This developed in the 1860s and then started to spread over the following decades. And this actually was phenomenally important, especially in the western United States and to some degree in the South as well, because the banking system at the time, there was a huge lack of currency. There was not currency in circulation, and so for rural parts of the country, the money order system became a really important way to conduct small-scale transactions. So if you wanted to subscribe to a magazine, like one of the ones I showed here, oftentimes you might send $3 money order through the mail. The flip side of this was actually that it was one of the few parts of the U.S. Post that was really bureaucratic. It was run as this kind of top-down, hierarchical, depended on forms, and it had a system of rules in place that basically constrained its growth. And so the person in charge of it was this kind of amazing bureaucrat who was there for 30 years, named Charles McDonald. Loved it so much, he was such a dedicated civil servant, he left $5,000 in his will to the money order system. But what's, I think, striking about this is that meant it actually constrained where that service was offered. Unlike the rest of the Post, which kind of expanded willy-nilly, it's showing up in all these distant areas, right? Catalpa, Salt River Valley. There should not be a post office there in many ways, right? The money order system is constrained to say, okay, you have to meet this kind of financial threshold of how much revenue you're bringing in. You have to have multiple sureties to kind of back up the system, right? So it's much more bureaucratic, basically part of the US Post that actually stands in contrast to some of this more Gossamer Network stuff. And so that becomes still really, really important for all sorts of different places. You can see flows of money from the Western United States to the Eastern United States. And it's performing all sorts of different services for people that are able to access it. And then mail order catalogs, which I find really interesting. So these would be, you would write into Sears Roebuck, for instance, and order a particular piece of machinery, and then it would be delivered to you. Up until the 1910s, the US Post would only carry very small things. I think it was less than 2 pounds, something like that. And so Sears Roebuck would have to send back to you something larger than that via freight, so railroad or express company. And those are private companies that are going to charge rates that a lot of people were really upset about, whereas the US Post had a single uniform letter rate. No matter where you lived, in the middle of the Salt River Valley, you could spend 2 cents and be able to reach anywhere in the country. So some of those private and public divisions, too, start to really come out in there. But like I said, chapter 6, you're going to love it.
What were the criteria for the location of post office? Were there objective criteria, or was it just patronage?
Yep, it was very complicated, extremely rule-based. So you basically wrote a letter saying, we want a post office, and then you mailed the letter. So you would send a petition. It didn't have to be a standardized petition. It was literally, I've looked at hundreds of these in the National Archives, handwritten oftentimes, 2 sentences just saying where it's going to go, right? You want to know mail route and you want a post office. And you would mail it to your congressperson. You would mail it to the post office department. You would mail it to your senator. And then it would eventually kind of work its way there. And the post office department would almost always say, okay, and that's it. There was no rules about it being too close to another post office or there being a certain number of people that had to serve, for instance. It was an incredibly capacious system. And it really wasn't until the late 1800s into the early 1900s when you start to see central administrators actually trying to impose some kind of restraint on, do you really need a post office in the middle of nowhere, right, to serve like 20 people? But through this period, it is extremely driven by the periphery, by these local communities, with very little oversight from Washington.
Cameron, thanks. Beautiful presentation. I am curious about your story about decentralization. So if we think about contemporary post offices in Great Britain, they're also highly decentralized. And they're being run out of private inns. They haven't been centralized yet. The innkeepers are the postmasters. So there's an argument to be made that this process that you're talking about is the process by which we see the modern state in action. It's not that these are decentralized yeomen who hate the state. It's that they are becoming the state. And over the course of their lifetimes, they'll have correspondence with Washington. As you so clearly showed, they'll become the officiators of the pension office. What do you think the role of ideology is in this? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, thank you, Joe. I think what's fascinating to me, at least, is that this was said again and again during the time, but really the most visible form of the state and the federal government was not, the tax person. It was your local store owner being the postmaster. And I think that actually does have a lot of implications. So the historian Brian Ballow, for instance, has written a phenomenal book that basically argues that during this period, the federal government hid a lot of its power by operating through these other networks and forms, so voluntary associations, state and local governments, and that this was kind of an intentional move on their part to kind of not worry Americans about this overly powerful central government. I actually tend to think that there's less intentionality involved. The image that comes to my mind, at least with looking at the US Post, is more like Fantasia and Mickey Mouse, where he starts doing the magic thing and then broomsticks start appearing and then dumping water everywhere and you can't control it and it's just kind of spinning out of control. Going back to the previous question, right? Local communities are the ones driving its expansion and really in charge of its operations. And so I think it forces us to reconsider like, what is the state? We oftentimes imbue it with a sense of intentionality, top-down nature, that sometimes I'm a little skeptical about just how much control they had during the time. And so I think this continues through the 20th century as well. There are all sorts of different ways in which the federal government continues to operate as a decentralized system. It still relies on a vast force of contractors, part-time federal workers. I was reading something from a couple years ago where basically they admitted they don't actually know how many people work for the federal government because there's like millions and millions of them. You see this as military contractors, obviously, abroad, and it's part of this kind of allowing the state to operate and extend across a really, really wide geographic area in all these local places, but obviously comes with kind of other implications as well, lack of oversight, abuse of power that can happen there too. So I don't think it's just a 19th century story. I think you're right that in a lot of ways it does define the modern state. So thank you. Yeah. So I'll tackle the first question, which was about the role of civil service reform during this period, and this idea of kind of trying to get rid of the system of patronage, where it just goes to Democrats or Republicans. So 1883, Congress passes the Pendleton Act, which is this landmark piece of legislation that tries to institute things like exams, right? Civil service exams that federal employees need to take. What's remarkable to me is that it basically does not touch the US Post for decades. Not until the 1910s do local postmasters, these kind of smaller postmasters who might be a store owner, actually have to start following any kind of civil service rules, all the way through the 1910s. And I think the reason for this is twofold, one of which is that it's still the largest source of political patronage for parties. So if you come into power, you have very little incentive to try to extend civil service reform, right? Unless you're the outgoing president, which you see them sometimes try to do. If they know that they're going to, lose control of the presidency, they're like, well, now it's time for civil service, right? And then the second reason being, I really think if you want to provide a service in all these distant places, it's actually really hard to require things like civil service exams. There's just an administrative overhead when you have 70,000 post offices that's just really difficult to implement in a lot of ways. The second question, if I remember it right, was to do with contraction in rural areas, but also things like today you're seeing extension of things like Amazon, delivery, kind of ordering, stuff like that. Is that roughly? Okay. What's really interesting today is that you're seeing a reverse of what's happening, whereas before the US Post would oftentimes graft this public service onto private infrastructure. Today, you're seeing things like FedEx graft its services onto the US Post, because the US Post is the only one operating in rural places, right? And if you are a private carrier, the incentive for you to establish service in these distant places, highly, not very densely populated, it's not going to turn a profit. And so they basically leave that to the US Post and then contract with them, start carrying packages. And what's interesting, I don't want to quite open the door to all the 21st century problems of the US Post, but bleeding money, right? Balance sheet is kind of in tatters for a lot of different reasons that I can get into. One of the few bright spots is actually package delivery. It's exploded in recent years, in large part, again, because private carriers are contracting with the US Post to deliver packages in these distant kind of rural areas. So, yep. Think? Go for
Is
it.
that microphone working over there? All right.
I have two questions. So go back to your idea about someone in some town could write in and say, hey, I'd like to have a post office here. Would somebody in Washington, D.C. write back and say, yeah, sure, go ahead and we'll pay you $12 a year? Or how did they get paid? How was that part of it? Second question is different. So we're talking about the late 19th century. So are we talking about a large percentage of the federal budget for the Postal Service, and was the Postmaster General a cabinet officer?
Yes, I'll maybe go in reverse order. So the Postmaster General was a cabinet level position at the time, and oftentimes would be given to like one of the most powerful Republican or Democratic operatives in the Republican or Democratic Party, right? So John Wanamaker, for instance, is a department store magnate, but he's also the chair of the Republican National Committee at the time. And that means because he's able to control tens of thousands of patronage positions. And then going back, so when you would write into to the post office department, say I want a post office, and they'd say yes, they would basically mail you, oftentimes they'd mail you a manual, like a book of rules, and then you would have to provide evidence, oftentimes of 2 sureties, so kind of financial backers in case you stole money from there. And then besides that, that's it. You would take your commission from people coming in and buying stamps, canceling stamps on outgoing mail, and that's how you'd calculate, they had a kind of system for calculating your commissions, and you would keep that and then send the remainder off to these more centralized locations, Denver, let's say, if you lived in Colorado, and that was that. So it was a very kind of lightweight system, and again, that meant that once the local mine ran dry and everyone left, the post office gets shut down within a couple weeks, right? So it's this kind of lightweight system that I think is really central to understanding that.
Here, I'll come to the back here. I think we'll just do a couple of more questions, and then we'll save the rest for people who get a book and want to come talk to you.
Stamps were issued, I think, in 1847, and I don't see a stamp on that envelope. When were stamps becoming prominently used? And I take it then that they just paid 2 cents in Arizona, and they put it on the bag?
Yep, this is where I was like, uh-oh, stamp collectors always know more about the actual machinery of that than I do. So my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that stamps were not necessarily widespread, the kind of adhesive stamps we would think of necessarily. And instead what would happen, these were called cancellations, where you would kind of stamp the actual letter, cancel the envelope, and then send it out. And that's where you'd pay kind of 3 cents. If someone wants to correct me though, please. Yep. Oh, that's true. So that might actually be the cutout stamp right there. Great eye. Thank you. So yes, it's missing a stamp. I knew that.
Cecil, you want to grab
Don't
maybe
put that
one
on
more?
C-SPAN.
Yeah, grab one more question over there.
How literate was our country at that time? In other words, did this encourage literacy? Or you don't think that rural people had that much access to schooling?
The U.S. was actually a highly literate country at the time, one of the most literate in the world. And there's a really great book written by the historian David Henkin that talks about how in the 1840s and in the 1850s, the U.S. Post actually instituted what was called postage reform, where it reduced the cost of sending letters. Up until that point, it was fairly expensive. And this actually opened the door for ordinary Americans to start sending way more mail and letters than they were used to. And so Americans really embraced the mail because it was affordable from that point on. And the idea, especially from basically 1863 on, is that you could send a letter literally anywhere for 3 cents. And so this kind of went hand in hand with literacy, and I'll kind of end with one example that I find really fascinating, which is that if you look at maps here, right, so if you take 1889, for instance, obviously there's a giant hole in the middle of the country. Does anyone know what that is? Okay, what we would say is Oklahoma today. Not quite then. This is Indian Territory, right? This is Indian Territory. And what you saw, there's a really wonderful book that just came out this year by the historian Justin Gage that writes about how Native people during the 1880s actually started using the U.S. Post very explicitly for their own purposes. So they would, and this actually, to go to your original question, spurred on a boom in literacy on reservations. That they would learn how to read and write and then use the mail to connect with relatives who had been separated, moved on to different reservations. They would send petitions to Washington saying, you know, we're not getting the supplies that we were actually guaranteed through this treaty. And it actually also used the mail to spread the ghost dance, which is this kind of religious revivalism movement in 1889 through the early 1890s. And the US Post is the infrastructure behind this. So even though there's a real lack of access to the postal system on reservations, you can kind of see this across up there in South Dakota right there is the Sioux Reservation, right, this big hole. You're seeing a lack of government services provided within reservations, which continues to this day. But the ones that do exist there, they're still able to access and use it. So it's a great question.
All right, well, that'll conclude for this evening. The Center for Presidential History and the Clement Center, we're so thankful for your time and for your interest, continuing all through the semester. So if you all would join me in thanking Cameron once again for his talk. And just as a final reminder, there are books for sale right out on the rotunda, and if you'd like to have a quick chat with Dr. Blevins or have him sign your book, just get it and then come back in here and we'll have him waiting here for you. So thanks again. Everyone drive safe.